Welcome back to Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. My name is Tom, and I'll be your guide as we spend this episode exploring Chapter 10 of Wizard's First Rule. In our last episode, Zed tells Richard what a seeker is and helps him accept anger as a part of himself that he has been denying for too long. Having made peace with himself, Richard is now in a position to help himself and others. Please note that these chapters contain spoilers, heavy spoilers, not just for this chapter, but future chapters and books in the series. If you haven't read this series yet, and you intend to, I'd encourage you to read the books first and then come back and see what I have to think about them. Spoiler alert, I find something new to think about them every time I read them. At the beginning of this chapter, best estimates place the time since the beginning of Wizard's First Rule on the 4th day. We begin the chapter at Zed's house. Zed gives Richard the baldric for the sword, but it is too small for him. If we continue using the symbolism and analogies made in the last chapter, then this is a fitting imagery to use when describing the thing which carries the sword of truth. In literature, it's a common practice to place an exaggerated importance on the things which give power to the protagonists. In the legends of King Arthur, the sword Excalibur is an example of such a weapon. Both the sword of truth and Excalibur are examples of brutally efficient weapons, on par with each other in terms of the destructive force they can give the wielder. However, there is a divergence of symbolism on the source of power. The sword of truth is kept in a finely tooled leather baldric. While it is described as being well crafted, it's also presented to us as a mundane and functional object without any additional special properties. By comparison, Avalon, the scabbard for Excalibur, is said to grant the wearer nigh immortality, making him immune to all sorts of physical things, as well as halting the aging process, granting an immunity to all known illnesses and disease. So in the legends of King Arthur, the symbol for his power is carried inside a supernatural vessel, which would be consistent with the literary theme of power needing to overcome adversity from an outside force beyond the reach of man. But if someone is the right person, then they will be given access to the divine power, and they can use it to finally make changes that they were powerless to make before it was given to them. In the Sword of Truth, the power is contained inside a regular leather scabbard. The meaning behind the plain scabbard is the power isn't held anywhere special, and anyone who recognizes the ability to know and understand truth ultimately comes from within, then they will be able to use it. Simply put, you don't need to be chosen to wield the truth. It exists within the reach of man. This would also explain why Zed never fiddled with the baldric after having it for 12 years. Only the sword mattered. In much the same way the symbolism here says, the vessel is unimportant. Only the truth matters. In addition, this is the first recorded introduction of Samuel's physical characteristics. The baldric being too small for Richard because the last seeker was smaller than him is an illustration of Samuel's inability to use every part of his mind, something we will explore in much greater detail when we're introduced to his character. While he had the power of truth, he was incapable of using it effectively because he had locked off parts of his mind for fear of accessing and generating the pain of cognitive dissonance, which tracks with Zed's final test to officially name Richard the Seeker. The baldric was too small because the last pretend seeker's mind was made smaller through his decision to put feelings ahead of what his eyes can see in front of him. Zed takes Richard and Caitlin to the edge of the grass next to 2 rock maple trees, one as thick as Richard's wrist and one as thick as Caitlin's wrist. In a small study from the Slender Wrist in 2015, they determined the average circumference for a man's wrist to be 7.25 inches. Given Richard as being described as bigger than most men, but still small enough that he regularly runs into men who are even bigger than he is, it is reasonable to place Richard in the 75th percentile of this distribution of data, giving him an estimated wrist circumference of 8.25 inches. Caitlin is not regularly described by the author as a statistical outlier in regards to her physical characteristics, only her beauty. So we will measure the circumference of her wrist at the statistical average for women of 7 inches. In 2007, the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York released an educational supplement titled Math for the Sugar Maple Tree, which states, on average, for the first 30 to 40 years, every 0.2 inches in diameter of the tree trunk will correspond with 1 foot in height for the tree. That means the larger tree with a calculated diameter of 2.6 inches would be 13 feet tall, with a horizontal area across the trunk of the tree at 5.4 inches squared. By comparison, the smaller tree with a diameter of 2.2 inches would be 11 feet tall, with a horizontal area across the trunk of 3.9 inches squared. The difference of 0.4 inches in the diameter is only a 20% increase from the smaller one to the larger one. However, the surface area across the large tree's horizontal plane is 40% greater than the surface area across the smaller one. Which is why purchasing a 12-inch pizza for $11 works out to the total area of 113 inches squared, reducing to a cost of 9.73 cents per square inch. And that's why it's a better deal than purchasing two 8-inch pizzas for a total of $16, which works out to a total of 100 square inches, reducing to a cost of 15.92 cents per square inch. Additionally, you have to factor in the dead zone around the outside of the pizza where no cheese or delicious toppings will be found. A 12-inch pizza has a circumference of approximately 38 inches, but two 8-inch pizzas have a combined circumference of 50 inches. If we assume a 1-inch depth between the edge of the pizza and the tasty toppings, to calculate the effective remaining tasty pizza area, we will subtract the square inches of untopped pizza from each one. That makes the effective remaining tasty pizza area for the 12-inch pizza 75 square inches, with a crust to topping ratio of 67% tasty topping pizza and 33% crust. By comparison, the effective remaining tasty pizza area for the 8-inch pizza is 50 squared inches, with a crust to topping ratio of 50% tasty topping pizza and 50% crust, which is why the biggest prices on the menu are usually for the smaller diameter pizzas. Remember to buy your pizza in bulk and save. Richard later mentions seeing Zed plant and care for those trees, but we're not given a timeline as to when they were planted. On average, maple trees grow a minimum of 12 inches per year, corresponding with the 0.2-inch increase in diameter. This puts the maximum age of Zed's memorial trees at roughly 13 years, closely corroborating with the current accepted Sword of Truth timeline from their fan site, which places the death of Zed's daughter, who is Richard's mother, 14 years before the events of Wizard's First Rule. Zed's daughter passed, and within a year he had planted two memorial trees to remember his wife and the last living thing that came from her. There are two possible interpolations which explain the difference in height between the trees. If Zed planted both trees at the same time, there is enough of a standard deviation in their average rate of growth for maple trees to account for the difference in size. This is the simplest and most probable explanation. However, the second explanation would be Zed planted the first tree, waited 2 years before planting the second. I'm going to tell you why I choose to believe the second explanation, and it's for irrational reasons. I'll leave it up to you to decide if these irrational reasons are good enough to make crazy talk sound like a good idea. First, since it's impossible to know due to a lack of explicit information, it is presumed the author has left this small part of the story up to the interpretation of the reader. So while Goodkind may have had an answer he preferred, by leaving this information vague, he has not denied the reader access to information, but rather he has placed himself in the same category as the rest of us by leaving this small detail of the story to his own personal interpretation. So because it does not violate the will of the author, I like to think of Zed as the type of character who cared about symbolism in his memories. And I think it would be within his character to plant a tree in memory of his dead wife and then wait 2 years to plant a second one to remember his dead daughter, because he wanted them to be remembered in the way that he knew them. His wife was full grown, and his daughter grew up alongside her. As the trees aged, the older one would reach its full maturity before the younger one and stop getting much taller. Then, over a period of years, which mimics the later life cycle of his daughter, he could see the younger tree continue its journey and become a second, unique, but equally developed tree, representing her transition from childhood to self-reliance. This version of Zed seems like a much more developed and reverent Zed than the version of him which plants both trees at the same time for the reasons listed above. Were my reasons crazy enough to make you feel like Zed would do something like that? I couldn't stop you if you wanted to tell me any different in the comments below. Zed tells Richard he's going to show him the most important thing about the sword, but he needs him to take back the Sword of Truth and abdicate his position of Seeker to Kaelin. In the story, there turns out to be things more important about the Sword of Truth than what Zed is about to demonstrate. But from his perspective, he is telling the truth. And symbolically, this is the author pointing out the biggest danger and limitation when it comes to learning how to maintain a healthy balance of cognitive health to protect the mind against the destructive effects of chronic, unresolved cognitive dissonance. While Zed directs the course of events, notice even for the purposes of demonstration, he still follows what he said in the previous chapter about the Seeker being allowed to be the Seeker until they choose not to be. He motions for Richard to give Kaelin the sword, and Richard decides to play along. Being a stickler for ceremony and tradition, Zed waves his hands in a flourish over her and formally names her the Seeker of Truth. Kaelin is described repeatedly as being confrontational and suspicious during this exercise. This is because while Richard was able to resolve his cognitive dissonance over being recognized as a Seeker, Kaelin has not addressed her dissonance over needing to tell Richard the truth about her and no longer being in control to leave after she does it. The sword feels heavy in her hands and she lets the tip rest on the ground. Right now, symbolically, Kaelin is not in a position to use the truth effectively because her mind has been limited by her own cognitive dissonance, and Zed takes full advantage. Zed tells Kaelin a story about Dark and Rawl's malicious tree-planting ways, saying the bigger tree was put there next to the smaller one by him to make him easy to find and kill at a time of his choosing. He tells her it's the same Dark and Rawls who was hunting her and killed her sister. Hate fills Kaelin's eyes, and Zed tells her to cut down the tree to stop Dark and Rawl. It works. With a single swing of the sword, Kaelin slashes the Sword of Truth through the tree, shattering at the point of impact, leaving only a ragged stump to remain as the rest of the tree crashes down nearby. Zed has just given Richard his second example of how the wizard's first rule can be used to subvert the free will of someone else. Zed tells Kaelin a lie she wants to believe. She wants to believe she can do something to stop Dark and Rawl. And once that seed is planted, Zed waters it with bits of information she already believes, making it sprout into a course of action, which she feels is exactly what she would have chosen for herself, when in reality, it was Zed manipulating her into thinking that, like a world-class marionette. User. What are those called? A world-class person who uses marionettes. He did that to Kaelin. I'm not proud of that, but I refuse to edit it out. He does this by triggering her anger, by repeating, it's the same Dark and Rawl who hunts her. It's the same Dark and Rawl who killed her friends and family. And if Zed wanted to, in that moment, he could have made her believe it was the same Dark and Rawl who crashed a bus full of nuns into an even bigger bus full of nuns before using the explosives to blow them all straight into heaven the hard way. During this moment, Kaelin is susceptible to any suggestion which would validate the feelings that she is having. Zed ties this misinformation to a call for action that Kaelin can do for him to make herself feel better. It's the same dynamic of mass indoctrination via weaponized cognitive dissonance that we've covered before. A media outlet makes an outrageous claim, threatens you and the things you hold dear, and then they tie that outrage into a call for action. The viewer forgets they were not the one who decided to focus on this particular issue. They were not involved in the list of possible solutions presented to them. So by the transitive property of mathematics, that beautiful and irrefutable thing, they weren't consulted at all. They were just told explicitly what to do in a way which would make them feel bad if they didn't listen. Or to say it another way, the act of not agreeing is presented as a more serious offense than the act of questioning the topic or call to action. After the tree is destroyed, Kaelin can no longer hold herself up and collapses to the ground. She gives back the Sword of Truth and sets 2 new world records, the first being the longest-serving combination Mother Confessor and Seeker of Truth, the second for the shortest-serving term as Seeker of Truth. Take your wins where you can get them. Kaelin collapses because her view of the truth was different from the actual truth. She uses the force of her belief to cut through, but suffers damage from her victory by refusing to acknowledge the virtue present in the thing she destroyed before she destroyed it. As shown in the last chapter, it's possible to overcome a competing cognitive dissonance by force. A strong enough application of the truth can destroy weak opposition, but successfully using force rather than empathy does not circumvent the cognitive laws of physics. Even though the force was sufficient to destroy the opposition, there was still an equal and opposite force applied in the amount of the maximum force resisting the attack. Without compassion, the use of the truth as a weapon through anger comes with a price. Richard asks Zed, "What's this all about then?" and tells him he knows Darkenrall had nothing to do with planting those trees there. And Zed pulls the old, "don't worry about it, go cut down the smaller tree" routine. And it works. Richard takes a mighty swing against the tree, only to have the air in front of him become thicker than a mouthful of honey and caramels. He tries again and gives up after the sword is unable to touch the tree. Richard asks Zed again, "What's all this about then?" Zed tells Richard when Kaylin cut down her tree, it would have made no difference if it were made of steel instead of wood, and the sword would have cut through it just as well. If we use 2.6 inches as the diameter and convert the material from wood into steel, then according to promotional pieces of sales literature produced by Union A Wire Co. titled Wire Rope Capacity Charts, that puts the breaking strength of a 2.6-inch diameter steel wire at just over 600,000 pounds of force, giving it a comparable amount of energy to a 2-ton truck traveling at 90 miles an hour. For the science buffs out there, just a quick explanation of why breaking strength was used as a metric instead of cutting force, and that's due to the description of what happens to the material when it makes contact with the sword of truth. It's the ragged stump, okay? That's the smoking gun. And the exploded point of impact much more closely resembles the blunt force required to break an object than the cutting force required to cut through it. So while the sword is sharp, in this instance, it behaves like a weapon of blunt force trauma instead of a slashing weapon. And that actually makes it a lot more powerful. The comparison is trying to cut a rope in half by swinging a samurai sword and trying to cut the same rope in half by swinging a baseball bat instead. The symbolism here is meant to represent a person's choice to protect themselves from cognitive dissonance above the choice to see the truth in front of them. Then they will be unable to overcome the dissonance created when the truth about something they think is in contradiction with what they actually already believe. That is summed up perfectly for the reader, both in the story and in real life. Zed says that reality isn't relevant and perception is everything. If you think it's an enemy, you can destroy it, whether true or not. It won't allow you to harm someone you think is innocent, but it will destroy whoever you perceive to be an enemy within your own limits. Only what you believe and not the truth of your thoughts is the determining factor. A contemporary example of this interaction can be found within the comments of divisive social media posts. Often the desire to preserve the validation created by aligning with the intended message is much more attractive than processing the dissenting information which has been brought forth by the conservation of cognitive dissonance. Because their intent views the target as an ally, they are powerless to use the truth against it. Richard is worried about this and says, "What if you aren't sure?" And Zed finishes the second half of his warning about what happens if he gets it wrong. Zed says, "You'd better be sure, my boy, or you're liable to find yourself in a lot of trouble. The magic could read things in your mind you're not even aware of. It could go either way. You could kill a friend, or fail to kill a foe." When Zed tells him this, the author uses the word overwhelmed to describe Richard. There is a symbolic significance for choosing this word above the long list of equally valid words, which would have described Richard's state of mind, and its origin, and it's also the origin of the wizard's 8th rule. The 8th rule is built around the fundamental force of constant cognitive consent. The theory of constant cognitive consent is the bad feelings created by cognitive dissonance will always exist, but the way we choose to respond is impossible without our consent. How a person responds to their feelings is how they choose to respond. Being blind to the interactions causing them to make a choice does not excuse them from the consequences of cognitive dissonance created when they deny the existence of the constant cognitive constant. Looking at it from this angle, the symbolic sense of being overwhelmed is a nod to the overwhelming sense of responsibility a person feels when they are no longer erroneously placing the responsibility on some outside force. Realizing the truth of that and internalizing it unlocks a part of the mind which was ignoring that truth before. It unlocks the limitless potential for growth, but at the same time unlocks the part of the mind which knows, for better or worse, the only person responsible for their cognitive success or failure is them. While this is in essence another way to describe the constant cognitive constant and how it affects everyone else all the time, the realization of this comes with a powerful sense of existential responsibility, enough to stop a human in their tracks and force them to reevaluate everything they thought they already knew. When Zed tells Richard he had better be right, he is also saying it doesn't matter if it's an overwhelming responsibility or not, because it's true. Stop wasting time living in the time when you didn't understand this. And that is a violation of the wizard's seventh rule. The realization is what matters. And now that it has been done, it's time to live in that moment instead. He also tells Richard the only thing he can do, he needs to get it right. And he needs to remember how important it is that he get it right. Because how he feels is not an escape from the laws of cause and effect. To take ownership of this law is to know the eighth rule. Deserve victory. Be justified in your convictions. Be completely committed. Earn what you want and need rather than waiting for others to give you what you desire. The wizard's eighth rule is the number one most commonly bastardized wizard's rule when it comes to the irrational justification of morality, and that is because the words of the wizard's eighth rule aren't just an explanation of the rule, they are also a test. The rule could have been stated much more specifically, but without a true understanding of the dynamic created by these two chosen words, it is impossible to use the wisdom of this rule in a way which isn't ultimately self-destructive. The phrase deserved victory is internalized as fact. Something challenges victory, makes humans feel compelled to defend how much they deserve victory. By chasing the feeling of denying anything which might suggest they don't deserve victory, they lose access to reality in favor of the comforting validation provided by having their worth determined for them, when the real message is to care about being the kind of person who deserves victory, justified by the truth and not waiting for others to do it for them. It is a fallacy for humans to believe that they are not the sum of their cognitive choices. These choices can be made up by the individual making them. They can only be made by the individual making them. They can be influenced, but the buck stops with the consent to accept or reject decisions and choices. And it is impossible to deserve victory when desire is also aligned with the higher power of personal feeling. The feelings become the higher power, and any claim to victory becomes invalid. The wizard's eighth rule isn't a weapon. It's a piece of armor, and it can be used outside of its intended purpose, but it's an analogous to using the wrong tool for the wrong job. The job won't get done as well, and the tools will get damaged in the process. Eventually, with enough repeated abuses, those tools stop working as well and break entirely, becoming useless in any situation. Richard isn't ready to pass this test completely right now, and he shows it by deflecting the issue rather than addressing it head on when he narrates, "It didn't really matter," he decided. He knew who he was after, and there was no doubt in his mind about him being the enemy. None whatsoever. Zed's point is, it matters so much all the time. You need to be aware of every doubt you have and have a rational explanation for each one of them. Richard is not even aware of the doubts he should be having, and instead defers to the comforting certainty of his emotions and sidesteps the issue entirely. Zed tells Richard, using the sword of truth to kill an enemy comes with a price, and the more powerful the enemy, the higher the price. Zed says, killing follows the same rules anger does. He says, sometimes it's the right answer. It's a terrible thing. It cannot be undone. And you pay a price for having done it. It diminishes you as a human. Richard knows the truth of this, having killed a man, his first man, 3 days ago, bringing the total number of men killed to Richard so far in the Sword of Truth series estimated at 1. Zed goes on to say the magic of the Sword of Truth exacts a price. Before Zed can explain this new concept, he needs to put all the pieces on the board which make up his explanation. Herbert H. Clark, or Herb Clark, a psycholinguist currently serving as professor of psychology at Stanford University, defines this communication practice as grounding. Grounding is a practice of creating a list of agreed-upon data, facts, and especially the interpretation of data. But before the interpretation of data is accepted by both parties, it is worthless for the purposes of debate and persuasion. So sorry, having a chart with some numbers on it isn't enough to overturn the constant cognitive constant, which states that people need to accept a thing before they will accept a thing, and it is their choice. Zed tells Richard humans are creatures of balance, and there's no such thing as good who is completely devoid of evil, nor is there a person who is evil completely devoid of good. Symbolically, this would convert to the differences between the virtuous and the vicious in human objectivism. There is no one who is completely virtuous, nor anyone who is completely vicious. This is a callback to Zed's warning about the magic working through intent. The warning is people will be blind to the viciousness in those they think are virtuous, and they will be equally blind to the virtue in those they think are vicious. The most extreme example of this can be shown by placing two facts next to each other. I'll start with one that everyone is comfortable with. Under Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany, as part of a deliberate program of extermination, systematically killed over 11 million people, including 6 million Jews. And now for the second. As the leader of Nazi Germany, he also was a strong supporter of the arts, theater, public health, and employment status of its citizens, and he was responsible for numerous policies meant to contribute to the public health and welfare of German citizens. If hearing those two statements said next to each other creates cognitive dissonance, then it's important to know what contradiction of information is causing it. Since both of these statements are easy to confirm and fact-check, the cognitive dissonance must be coming from something else which isn't fully true. The most common place for this dissonance to occur is a fallacy of correlation without causation. If the instinctive response is to deny the documented good because it would somehow legitimize or justify the documented evil, this is where the problem is, and the mind knows it. It just doesn't know how to handle the information that it has other than giving a person a flight or flight response, instead of the correct answer, which is non-engagement. The answer is the same as it has always been. The man did evil things. The man did good things. And it is up to us to decide to use this information ourselves to come up with a judgment of the man that we are responsible for and take ownership of. No one is powerless to accept a person as good or evil. It is always a choice, even when the choice is wrongly presented as a fallacy of consent, even when the act of questioning the exercise is treated as an act of evil. Zed's argument about the balance of viciousness and virtue is just another way of explaining our feelings do not change the way people's minds work. Due to the conservation of cognitive dissonance, everyone will instinctively cast themselves as the hero of their own story. But much like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, the method of observation changes the result. This is how each person is able to generate their own unique cognitive force. The balance is the same, but the point of observation changes the end result. Zed says his cat eats mice, and while both he and the cat are fine with that, the mice would have a different point of view. And it's the same way every murderer thinks his victim needed killing and that they were justified to do it. Richard says it's crazy because Darkenral killed his father and wants to subjugate everyone. And he just wants to lead a quiet life as a woods guide, and Zed is making Darkenral sound like him instead of a dangerous person. Richard makes the exact fallacy of correlation without causation Zed was talking about. Just because Richard thinks Darkenral is evil does not mean Darkenral thinks he's evil, and both of them use the same thought process to arrive at their decisions. Richard wrongly assumes because Darkenral is evil and he is good, that they can have nothing in common, matching the symbolism established earlier about how allowing your passion to rule your reason results in an inability to see the good in those you feel are evil and to see the evil in those you feel are good. Zed addresses Richard's concerns using a combination of Wizard's first rule and the conservation of cognitive dissonance by accusing Richard of not paying attention to what he's saying, instead telling him he isn't understanding it. Zed creates a subtle push for Richard to refute this claim by proving to Zed he was paying attention. Zed applied the force. Richard responded by instinct, chasing that feeling. When Richard responds, repeating the information that was presented to him, Richard is forced to choose between admitting he wasn't paying attention or admitting he understands the argument completely but does not agree with it. This creates its own dissonance when analyzed internally. Richard is left with no choice but to choose the lesser of two painful instances of cognitive dissonance when he proves he was paying attention while proving he was wrong at the same time, which explains the method Richard uses to answer. Richard answers Zed in a quiet voice. She was able to do it because she thought she was right. After Richard says this, Zed pulls the old switcheroo when he says, because Richard said it, it must be true. And it works. In reality, what Zed is saying is no more or less true than it ever was. How Richard, or Zed for that matter, feel about this is irrelevant. But because Zed has already used the method is irrelevant so long as the result is good, he has no problem convincing Richard to agree with him by using faulty logic that he knows will get the job done. From Zed's perspective, Richard is made better by this application of cognitive violence, and the justification for Zed's actions is explained just a few paragraphs earlier when he says, "You had better be sure or you're liable to find yourself in a lot of trouble." Zed warns Richard Darkenrahl is more dangerous because he firmly believes he is right. What he is also saying goes against the core message about personal free will. When Darkenrahl recognizes that he has the full authority and autonomy to make the decisions he does for the reasons he has, he is strengthened by it. When Richard believes a higher authority somehow grants this power and is only accessible when the higher power allows it, he places limitations on his own actions which are self-imposed. If the wrong person feels justified for killing, then they are able to act on desire because they have recognized their ownership of that decision. When Richard knows an innocent life will be lost, he chooses not to intervene because he doesn't feel he has ownership of the decision. Then the methods become irrelevant because dead is dead. Zed is desperately trying to demonstrate to Richard, even if he is wielding the full power of the sword of truth, until he decides he has the authority to recognize it and use it, his weapon will be ineffective. Richard struggles through the difficult idea, despite the potential in the end for it to end in disaster. Ultimately, the responsibility to make the decision about what is and isn't a moral act must fall to him. And if he decides he isn't the one to make that decision, no one is going to step in and make it for him. And as a result, he will be powerless against those who use their choices to act. Richard says, "You mean it's not only what he does, which makes him dangerous, but also that he feels justified in doing?" And Zed tells him a parable about some stolen bread and a stolen baby. Richard gets the point when he says, even if this woman was wrong about his baby stealing ways, she would be a terrifying force because her actions would have the full weight of her conviction behind them. Zed's point is a human cannot reach their full potential if they are fighting themselves in the process. And Darkenrahl is not fighting himself. He fully believes he is right. Zed gives Richard the cue to say his next line when he says, "Darkenrahl thinks he's right," implying he can win because of this. He also tells Richard exactly how to deliver his line by using a fierce expression when he says it. This prompts Richard to respond to cognitive dissonance in an equal and opposite amount when he says he is in the right with an equally fierce expression. Zed realizes Richard is agreeing with him with his words, but hasn't internalized the message. Because he senses he is close to understanding it, Zed switches to the wizard's fourth rule to remind Richard he is trying to teach him an important lesson because he cares about him. Richard uncrosses his arms and finally allows himself to internalize the words. He says he doesn't like it, but he understands the message. Not wanting to dwell any longer, Richard takes Zed's previous advice about walking backwards into the future by needing to have his feelings fully validated before he can process and asks what Zed is talking about when he says there's a price for using the sword of truth. Zed tells Richard using the sword to kill forces the wielder to see all of the evil in himself and all of the good in the one they killed. And the magic makes it worse, punishing the body and the soul. The pain is described as very real, very powerful, having real and devastating effects. But Zed says it comes from the self as well as the magic. Zed is making two different statements to reference the same thing. When he talks about Richard feeling bad on his own, he's talking about the undeniable truth which people are confronted with when they kill another person. Regardless of the justification, there is no amount of logic that can erase the good and the potential for good in the person who was killed. Those are facts. They're not dependent on any outside factors. Symbolically, the conservation of cognitive dissonance says even a successful application of cognitive violence, which destroys that which is in front of it, still obeys the conservation of cognitive dissonance. The user will feel the impact, and the impact will be in direct proportion to the maximum amount of force the point of impact can withstand. Zed says, the more powerful the enemy, the more powerful the pain. Symbolically, this refers to someone who has access to the wisdom of the wizard's rules and knows exactly how to use them, but decides to use them for vicious reasons. The greater pain from their destruction comes from the pain associated with the destruction for their tremendous potential for good. The next part is fairly straightforward. Zed says rage is the only defense against the machine that is the naked truth of the destruction which has occurred. And the stronger the rage, the stronger the shield against that pain. Zed is referring again to his warning to Richard. He had better be right, because rage is the only shield against the pain, which means Richard must be sure his rage is rooted in reality and not just emotion. Rage rooted in truth validates the conservation and protection of life, even in the face of a loss or damage to life that would have gone on to cause greater harm than the one inflicted by their death. The pain is real. The loss is real. The rage is what gives you an equal and opposite force to prop up against it. And if reason is rooted in yourself through cognitive dissonance, it will crumble under the undeniable truth of what has been done, and the full force of dissonance will rebound on the believer of the paradox, doing catastrophic damage to the rational mind in the process. Zed tells Richard he wouldn't have given him the sword if he wasn't able to use his anger, because the magic would tear him apart if he did. When Zed spells this out, once again he is teaching Richard the importance of the wizard's 8th rule. If he doesn't know with certainty his anger is justified, no one else will make the determination for him, and waiting for outside validation will tear him apart. Richard stares off into the sunset and then ponders the encroaching darkness that is coming for all of them. Determined to find a way across the boundary, Richard accepts the sword will help him, and that is all that matters. He accepts there's a cost to everything in life, and he is willing to pay this one. This is the moment where Richard takes complete ownership of his agency of free will. Richard has always had ownership of this free will, but in this moment, he sees the nature of life is bounded by the laws of cause and effect. And if he isn't willing to be the vehicle of his own cause, there will be no effect to follow. He recognizes there is a price, and he consents to pay it. Because Zed has a deep understanding of prophecy, he puts his hand on Richard's shoulders in preparation to shake some sense into him. Because time is short, Zed has no choice but to ruin Richard's catharsis of character growth by dropping another truth bomb on him when he says, "You aren't going to like this, but you can't use the sword of truth on Dark and Rahl." Richard ignores what Zed says and says, "What?" forcing Zed to fulfill his prophecy by shaking some sense into him. In 2018, aceconnection.com released an article written by David Berselli, PhD, and an international expert in areas of trauma intervention and conflict resolution, titled Therapeutic Tremoring, Shake Off Stress and Trauma. In the article, he discusses tension and trauma release exercise, or TREEs, which is highly fitting for this chapter about trees, a simple yet innovative series of stimuli meant to safely activate the natural reflex mechanism of shaking or vibrating. This releases muscular tension, calming down the nervous system. Berselli states, when this muscular shaking and vibration mechanism is activated in a safe and controlled environment, the body is encouraged to return back to a state of balance. This therapeutic tremoring helps the body release deep muscular patterns of stress, tension, and trauma. While Zed is literally shaking some sense into Richard, he tells him the magic of Orden protects him, and if he tries to use the sword on him, he will be dead before it reaches him. When Richard interjects again about how unfair that is, Zed tells him he doesn't make the rules, he only knows how they work, and if Richard ignores his warning and tries, he will die. We aren't formally given this answer until the book Confessor, but symbolically, we already have everything we need to explain this interaction. On the surface, the boxes of Orden are tied to the Sword of Truth as a lock and key. Because the sword is tied to the magic of Orden, one is prevented from destroying the other because they are two parts of the same thing, and to destroy one is to destroy both. Once someone activates the magic of Orden, they're drawn into that relationship. Symbolically, it's a very similar concept. The magic of Orden is a person's journey to come to terms with the truth around them, and if they decide to place their own feelings above the things they observe in reality. The person is already wielding the truth. They have access to the wizard's rules and the knowledge contained, but during the year they are protected from having the truth used against them because they're already using it and fighting against the harm that it can do to them. The measure isn't what is being used, it's if it's being used well. The truth simply exists, and the 1-year timeline represents our ability to come to terms with it before our rational minds are destroyed by contradiction. To say it simply, you can't use the truth to destroy someone when the truth is the tool which will destroy them if they don't find the right answer in time. We'll cover this in greater detail toward the end of the novel, but the gist of it is the 1-year timeline represents the time we have to figure it out. And by using the truth to cut short an internal struggle to come to terms with the truth, it's a paradoxical argument. Either we have the time we have to figure it out or we don't. When the truth is the thing trying to destroy you already, you can't use the truth to make that go faster. Caitlin says they can't do it because the sword is his most important weapon, and it is definitely very important because the sword of truth is his most important weapon. And before she can say anything else, Zed roughly lays hands on Richard's head and jabs him a bunch of times, saying the Seeker's brains and his heart are his most important weapon. And if you remember from earlier, Zed also mentions having the courage to face his fears and the courage to be the kind of person who will get it right so that his mind is no longer the servant to the whims of his emotion. And if you combine this with Richard's repeated wishes to return home to his simple home in Heartland, this makes Richard the entire cast of The Wizard of Oz. And Brophy is Toto. Zed says the sword is just a tool and he can find another way. Richard is surprised his emotions aren't overwhelming him. He feels calm and is determined because in that moment he's no longer suffering from the effects of self-inflicted cognitive dissonance. In a rare miss, Zed misreads the situation and starts to pour on another round of the wizard's fourth rule, mixed with a dose of correlation without causation, when he starts to equate being on Richard's side with him being right. I'm sorry, my boy, I wish I could change the magic, but Zed's feelings about the matter haven't changed a single fact, but Zed's misreading of the situation makes perfect sense because he's used to dealing with almost exclusively people who only communicate through a filter of cognitive dissonance. It's like having a conversation with someone in English, but halfway through the other person starts speaking Spanish. Both people know both languages, but there's a moment of recalibration where Zed must choose a different combination of words to reach the same effect. Richard tells Zed that the truth is what matters, and at least for the moment, his ability to think is fully within his control instead of under the whim of his emotions. He says, titles, the sword, magic, all of it are a means to an end. That's all. Zed transforms his grounding physical assault on Richard into a congratulatory physical assault by hitting him on the shoulder repeatedly, while simultaneously telling him he did a good job and got it all right. Zed immediately proves he can congratulate someone without hitting them when he pats himself on the back for choosing such a great seeker. Kaelin apologizes for cutting down Zed's tree because she found out that it was planted in memory of his dead wife instead of a large covert homing beacon tree placed by Dark and Raw to find the old wizard, even though other powerful magic prevents anyone from remembering what his name is or what he looks like. And even though Zed has the knowledge of this tree somehow, and it is the only direct link and singular tie to his existence Darkenrall is aware of, he somehow decided the safest way to protect himself would be to build the only house for miles that would be visible from this tree and be within walking distance of Darkenrall's homing beacon trees. While Zed would be well within his rights to make all of these points, he takes the high road, settling for making her feel better by saying it was a price he gladly paid to teach the new seeker a valuable lesson. Richard finally starts acting like things are serious when he ignores Kaylin's judgment has been clouded by an intense but temporary bloodlust for murdering trees, preferring to think of the solution instead. Richard's train of thought starts out strong when he thinks about the problem of how to cross the boundary, twice, before repeatedly asking himself if they were going to die because it was impossible. To his credit, Richard shows an instinctive understanding of the wizard's ninth rule. A contradiction can't exist in reality, not in part and not in whole. To believe in a contradiction is to abdicate your belief in the existence of the world around you and the nature of the things of it, instead to embrace any random impulse that strikes your fancy. To imagine something is real simply because you wish it. A thing is what it is. It is itself. There can be no contradiction. Richard tries to figure out if it's even possible, and something in Richard's mind tells him it is, insisting it could be done, insisting he knows the truth of it. If memory serves me well, it was an article titled 6 Things Your Unconscious Mind is Trying to Tell You, written for consciousrethink.com, that defines the communication from subconscious to what we interpret as gut instinct. It defines that as intuition. Intuition is mostly just the final fact of your unconscious mind, which has made calculations based off available information and sensory inputs. Intuition is the moment when a decision requires final approval from the conscious mind, when there is a conflict between two different paths of the brain. Later on, Richard's ability to pull knowledge from within his gift will match up well with the symbolic, instinctive understanding that creates our own cognitive dissonance and tries to warn us against it. The message is to stop and reverse course if necessary to avoid a collision. We habitually interpret this message as a call to brace for impact instead. It's like that moment in the movie theater when you yell at the blonde woman not to go in the shower after taking a suspicious phone call, and you can see it coming from a mile away, and she goes there, she's gonna get stabbed. But the louder you scream at her not to be stupid, the faster she gets into the shower and gets stabbed to death. And if you'll allow me to work blue for a moment, I can really ram this idea down into a single swollen point. Cognitive dissonance is the gasp that you let out when you see someone is about to get hit in the nuts, and there is nothing in the universe that can stop that from happening. It's already in motion. It's the realization that the thing you're about to do will be self-destructive and painful. Cognitive dissonance is the gasp right before the nut shot. This is going to hurt. And if you got out of the way instead of bracing for impact, this wouldn't have happened. Once again, Richard's gift gives him a gentle nudge to let him know he's on the right track. In a moment of clarity, Richard communes with nature harder than Disney's Pocahontas during her waterfall swan dive. With mountains on his mind, he thinks about crossing over more times than a professional John Edwards impersonator before he realizes there must be a past because the Book of Counted Shadows is magic, and it couldn't have been there before the boundary came up. Just to be sure, he asks Zed to swear to him twice that he has never sent anyone through the boundary and that no one but a wizard like Darkenrall would be able to do it. Magic's ability to cross through the boundary is once again symbolic of the rational mind's ability to cross through the mental barriers which have been placed around certain parts of our psyche. After getting Zed all worked up by not telling him what's going on, Richard gets the answer he needs and proceeds to ignore his grandfather when he asks him 3 different ways if he's come up with a solution. Richard instead realizes that because his father got the Book of Counted Shadows to him, he must have been able to leave Westland to do so. Because Zed was the only creature of magic in Westland, his father would have needed help to do it. And because Zed said he never helped anyone, that means his father must have found a pass since they had no magic to help him pass through. Richard makes an error of logic here, but it is not an error of logic that would have changed the outcome. Our outside knowledge of the series tells us about Nathan and Anne's involvement with George Cypher. They needed him to do things, and together both of them would have been able to travel the boundary, just like Zed and Darkenrall. George could have been trapped in Westland, found by Nathan and Anne, led through the boundary into the Midlands. However, even if he did think of another wizard besides Zed coming into the Midlands and taking him through, it still wouldn't have changed the most logical course of action. Without concrete proof or evidence or context of either scenario, Richard would have no way of knowing which scenario was more likely. He would have no choice but to play any odds potentially above 0 instead of doing nothing with a guaranteed success rate of 0. Richard ignores all of this and tells everyone what to do when the next words out of his mouth are, "We will go have supper." And it works. Caitlin gets excited about bread, and Zed swears about finally being validated by someone else thinking about dinner for him. I'm on the fence about calling this passage a stroke of genius instead of a happy accident. Zed experiences a release of cognitive dissonance the moment someone else remembers dinner, which means Zed had been wishing someone would remember dinner when all along he had the power to remember about dinner himself. Zed basks in the validation of being given what he always had the power to give himself. While Zed is basking in the moment of validation, Richard takes advantage of his malleable state and says after dinner they're going to pack and set out for the Midlands tomorrow morning. And it works. With some stew in his belly, Zed remembers. Richard thinks he has it all figured out and asks him to tell everyone what he knows. But Richard plays hard to get when he answers Zed with a riddle. The author takes a moment to remind us, even though their owners may be experiencing the most harrowing challenges of their lives, cats will insist upon themselves until they are given treats and attention. Caitlin feeds someone else's pet, and Zed asks Richard how he knows there's a way across. Zed pulls the old, "Look at me, I'm an old man, and we're best friends, and we shouldn't be keeping secrets from one another" routine, and Richard is in no mood for any of that noise when he says he's had more honesty from strangers. Because he is right, both Zed and Caitlin take the win and let their curiosity go, because having the answer they need is more important than understanding what the answer they is. Richard isn't messing around about keeping his secrets to himself for now and gets back to the task of preparing provisions for their travel to the Midlands. Richard asks Caitlin what's with the dress, and she tells him it's how people recognize her, and everywhere she goes she is provided food and lodging. Richard makes the point of it not being the best idea to wear something so readily identifiable and memorable while they're being hunted, and she's happily able to follow along with his advice because traveling through the wilderness during the fall in a dress makes her cold. Having gotten away with feeding another person's pet a small scrap of food, Caitlin escalates the behavior of feeding it an entire meal of her leftover stew. Richard leads the discussion on what to take and what to do with and without. We learn that Richard has a collection of different kinds of provisions, specifically designed to last for long trips like the one they're about to take. Richard decides the risk is not worth the potential reward and thinks about the real problem. He may have implied a greater level of confidence than the development of his ideas would merit. He tells himself he has until morning to figure it out. The author sets up another point of expansion by comparison when he mentions Richard's timeline for coming up with a plan. This makes the revelation towards the end of the chapter about how much time they really have hit much harder because it feels like time has been lost, even though it never existed in reality. The only thing that changed was their perception of the world around him. Dinner is interrupted when Zed's cat starts sensing something unfamiliar and reacts by raising its fur. Once again, they notice the sign and choose to pay attention to it. They realize they are in danger. This is not dissimilar to the way our intuition works. Something beyond our conscious understanding has figured out something that we haven't, and we're alerted to it. What it has figured out may not be correct, and it is still up to our rational minds to observe and dissect, but sometimes our minds are able to give us information without giving us the capacity to understand what it means, much like our relationship with cognitive dissonance. We experience it the same as everyone else. The divergence is the decision if the message is telling us to get out of the way or brace for impact. All three of them get up. Richard looks out the window to see what's going on, and Zed goes to the front door with Caitlin in tow. Richard and Zed are following the same thought process, but Zed is able to skip a step because of his magical senses. We later learn that the use of magic most often requires conscious effort and guided intent. It would make sense for Zed not to know what was outside his home if he was not looking outside of his home when there was something for him to know. Richard uses his senses that he has access to gather more information by looking out the window. And true as toasted toads, I guarantee that Zed already had his magic sense activated before any of them even stood up. Caitlin places her trust in Zed and follows him outside. When they all make it outside, there's a group of approximately 50 men. They have torches and weapons and are described as still being in their work clothes. Richard looks into their faces and sees what his logic and reason tell him is a group of hard-working and honest men. His senses give him a different perspective. In this moment, they are not the kind people he knows, but rather an angry, dangerous, superstitious, and cowardly lot. Zed takes the lead and does not engage them directly by challenging their presence on his property. Instead, he asks them, "What's all this then, boys?" This creates a vacuum of cognitive dissonance, and because this group of men are currently being ruled by their passion and not their reason, they are powerless to do anything except listen to whatever their feelings tell them is the right thing to do. It's correlation without causation. They equate feeling right to being right. Both can be true at the same time, but there is no concrete link from one to the other. By denying them validation, Zed creates a feeling which compels them to give Zed more reasons to validate them, so they will feel better about their decision to kill him. It doesn't mean Zed isn't correct, or that they are correct. It's only the conservation of cognitive dissonance. They created the dissonance, gave it direction, magnitude, and force, and sent it to Zed. The act of making contact by being challenged is what creates the feeling that reinforces their own belief. Because their conviction comes from feeling rather than from reason, the act of removing the impact removes a source of their strength. While the lack of validation gives them a lack of confidence, there is a stronger force in play that prevents them from recognizing this and responding accordingly. At this stage, they need to decide if the feelings they have been using to determine the difference between a good and a bad thing are what they will trust, or they need to decide if their feelings are lying to them and convince them through reason that they better have a good reason to come here and bring violence to Zed. Either way, the end result is the same. They are forced to prove themselves, having no choice but to reveal the exact source of their feelings, revealing to Zed what weak points he needs to attack. Because they need to feel right, to know they are right, and Zed does not, when they tell him everything that makes them feel right, they are telling him exactly where their power comes from. Once they do that, all Zed has to do is use the conservation of cognitive dissonance to redirect whatever force he encounters back onto the ones who created it. A lack of engagement does not circumvent the conservation of cognitive dissonance. It simply redirects the force back onto its source. This is very similar to the difference between Zed's response to the underworld spell in chapter 47, when his own spell is redirected against him, paralyzing him in place. But Richard's response to this in chapter 43, when Dark and Rahl uses a similar magic to paralyze him. But because Richard does not struggle against it directly, he is able to shed its effects. By that analogy, Zed is the rowdy crowd and Richard is Zed. It's the same interaction, but the perception of the target and whether they allow their reason or their feelings to tell them what is good or bad is the key difference. And that is the entire point that Goodkind has been hammering home as many different ways as possible in this chapter. John, a man Richard recognizes, steps forward and tells Zed that there's trouble caused by magic, and he's at the bottom of it. John calls him a witch. Poor, foolish John has just given Zed everything he needs to redirect his own cognitive dissonance back onto itself. Zed does not miss the opportunity, and he begins the process of grounding when he repeats the answer as though he doesn't understand what John is saying. This creates another lack of validation, but by a different method, because Zed is acting like he almost is convinced by them, but isn't quite sure. And since he stops there, the lack of cognitive impact doubles back on John, making him feel like he needs to try even harder to convince him. Zed isn't trying to understand their position anymore. He's already done that. He is reinforcing John's own position so that when he directs him to turn his own conclusion back on itself, it will be strong enough to break through the other feelings that are making John think that this is a good idea. Zed doesn't need to satisfy the burden of convincing him. All he has to do is make him feel worse about his current decision than the decision which turns out to be better for Zed. At this point, it doesn't even matter who is right. Once he creates that feeling, John's own mind will take care of the heavy lifting for him and chase after the position that brings him the least amount of cognitive pain. John doubles down and repeats what he said and tells Richard and Kaylin not to worry about it, or he will be forced to do to them what they intend to do to Zed if they don't walk away. Kaylin tells the men to leave and that they'll regret it if they don't listen, which they take as a sign of encouragement. They laugh at her, become more confident in their position, and declare her to be a witch, equally deserving of what they're planning for Zed. Richard realizes that by engaging with him the way she has, the men are strengthened and energized. He steps in front, pushing Kaylin and Zed back. Richard starts out strong when he asks John in a calm and friendly voice, how is Sarah? And establishes that he knows many of them to be good men. Richard doesn't know it, but he is effective in lowering the temperature of the room. Then he tells them this isn't something they want to do and that they should go home and be with their families instead. Richard's argument doesn't pass the fallacy of consent because he acts like he has the ability to compel these men to action by the strength of his own argument without stopping to get their permission first. Richard undoes all of his progress and gives John an injection of his own cognitive dissonance, which creates an equal and opposite reaction inside him, creating the opposite effect that he intended. John tells Richard to leave before he decides to rope him in with Zed and Kaylin. Zed allows this to continue because it helps him achieve the one thing that he will need to resolve the situation. Zed is still watching the growth of John's increasing dissonance. We can measure the progress of this dissonance by watching John's rising level of frustration when Zed denies him the validation he's asking for. The first time he said Zed was a witch, it was in a plain voice. The second time, he said it with an exclamation point, implying a greater passion. The third instance matches the passion of the second presentation, but also includes a good old-fashioned weapon waving. The mob pushes forward and Richard draws the sword of truth. Collectively, the men experience a jolt of intuition when they have no choice but to recognize they are in mortal danger. This message is from their subconscious mind, providing a snap assessment of their current situation. However, intuition does not have the executive power when it comes to making decisions. It's more like a pop-up window that lets us decide what to click on or to learn more. Or if you want to X out of it so you can go back to what you were doing before the interruption. The moment of hesitation only lasts a moment for the mob because their metric for making decisions, feeling good, tells them that they must be right because they believe they are right. Richard uses the sword to destroy John's weapon, splintering it with a loud crack. Again, we see the symbolism here showing that the truth isn't a weapon which cuts. It's a weapon which destroys after making contact with anything that makes contact with the truth. The original argument is completely unrecognizable. The symbolism wouldn't be nearly as clean if the parts of what the truth was used to destroy were still intact and recognizable. Richard uses the sword and the threat of violence to make everyone back up. In this moment, the force of Richard's words creates a more powerful feeling than the one which was causing them to press forward. This is a representation to one of the permutations of the conservation of cognitive dissonance. Kaylin's attempt to talk them away shows what happens when one force is not sufficient to overcome the other. An equal and opposite amount of force is transferred, and both sides become equally but opposingly strengthened. When Zed practices non-validation, he shows what happens when cognitive dissonance encounters a lack of impact. Richard is demonstrating what happens when one force is much bigger than the other. The men might not realize it, but Richard is too much for them to ever handle, especially if Zed uses his gift to get involved. This lack of awareness is created by their reliance on how they feel, and absent outside intervention, they will destroy themselves by bracing for an impact they cannot withstand. John says they can't stop all of them, and while they're just trying to save their families, Richard follows his instincts and angrily presents logical evidence that they're trying to hurt someone who has repeatedly been there for them. He tries to turn the mood of the crowd by putting his sword away, while he continues his logically rooted arguments. This doesn't work because John keeps telling Richard he cares about Zed being a witch, and Richard keeps telling John he shouldn't care about the thing he cares about because Zed is a good person and has helped them in the past. They think magic is dangerous for their families and is bad. Zed has magic. That means he's a witch, and it's their job to protect their families by saving them from the evil magic man. Zed steps in finally because this is the moment he was waiting for. Richard notices Zed is amused by all of this. He pulls Richard and Kaylin aside and asks them to watch and learn. Zed greets the men politely, saying, "Gentlemen, good evening. How nice to see you all." Goodkind sneaks in a quick demonstration of the conservation of cognitive dissonance when some of the men feel compelled to greet him despite their position that they will be murdering him soon. Much like Bugs Bunny giving Elmer Fudd a birthday cake holding a stick of dynamite, Zed pulls the old, "Since you are going to kill me anyway, can I convince you to feel a little better about the whole unjustly murdering me thing by asking for a completely reasonable and seemingly inconsequential request?" And it works. Zed tells Kaylin that she was using too little force, and the end result would have ended in them being destroyed. Then he tells Richard that even though he's able to overpower the situation by force, it would be using an atomic bomb when a slingshot would have achieved the same result. Zed gives them both a pat on the head when he says they tried their best, but it's time for the master to show them how to make this group of angry men listen. Zed gives them a clue for what to pay attention for when he says they won't be affected by his words. This is Terry Goodkind code for understanding exactly how some humans are blind to reason because they have chosen feeling like they are right above acknowledging anything that challenges that. Zed is telling Richard and Kaylin feelings are only suggestions you can choose to follow or not, and learning how to do so makes a person immune to the shenanigans that Zed is about to pull. Zed leaves Richard and Kaylin to wonder what he's talking about while he smiles and waves to the angry mob, asking John how the little girl he saved in the middle of the night was doing between now and when Zed saved her from death by exposure or animal attack. Zed says that she's fine now, but recently a two-headed calf was born, and that's proof that Zed is a witch, and therefore a danger to their families. Because the men are so steadfastly loyal to making their decisions to avoid cognitive dissonance, Zed needs to shake things up a bit and give them all a big jolt. Zed pulls the old, "Before you're going to kill me, you have to use the proper words to nail my gender and mystical identity, or else people will think you're a fool," trick on them. And it works, because John's conviction comes from feeling like he's right. He's unable to continue until he feels like he's right, and eventually agrees to follow each of Zed's suggestions on how he can properly label him before they will be allowed to march in a group and murder the old man. This is the moment Zed has been building to. He has been getting John to agree with him over and over that Zed has magic and that is a danger to their family. By using strategic, weaponized cognitive dissonance, Zed has created repeated interactions, all of them specifically designed to make John feel like it was his idea to feel more and more strongly like the magic was the problem. Zed proceeds to ask them what they think someone with magic would be capable of. The men offer a few weak suggestions, but because Zed continues to withhold validation from them about any of it sounding dangerous, they're compelled to chase the feeling by offering even more reasons they're confident Zed will leave them with no choice but to agree with them. Zed gives the men what they say they want when he agrees with every crazy and a half-baked suggestion that they come up with. This is the cognitive equivalent of each of these men taking the time to arrange themselves perfectly in a line so that Zed can take them out with a single shot from his dissonance-piercing, high-impact cognitive assault bazooka. They willingly offered their reason for mobilization as him having magic, and then willingly offered up a list of impossibly overpowered abilities that someone with magic would have. At this point, all Zed has to do is inject the smallest push to tip the balance. Zed tells the men they must be incredibly brave to think that torches and farming tools would be enough to stop someone who could kill them with a look or crack open the earth and swallow them whole. The price that Zed extracts from them for himself is to make them deal with the cognitive dissonance he creates when he calls them brave for accepting the truths they have given him. Because they are currently blind to evil in themselves, they're unable to admit out loud that they're not brave, even though it is very clear they have every reason to be afraid by their own admission. It's a two-pronged attack. While they're trying to resolve the paradox of the wisdom behind using torches and pitchforks to attack a nearly omnipotent master of the mystic arts, which ultimately must end with the inevitable conclusion of this being a bad idea, they also have to continue to pretend to be brave when their own logic and reason is practically screaming for them that they're being a bunch of morons. All the while, due to the careful manipulation of the cognitive conservation of dissonance, Zed has shifted his status in their eyes from future murder victim to position of authority on all things mystical and unknown. Because they were the ones that decided he has magic, they accept that he must know about magic. Zed uses this knowledge to invent a list of other terrible things he could do to them, which they hadn't thought of before, deepening their fears even more. Zed spends so much time building layer upon layer of different reasons to fear him that Richard and Kaylin start to get bored and tired. Which is smoking gun evidence that while Zed is putting on a master's level clinic on how to do this sort of thing, they were not listening when he told them to pay attention so they could learn something, preferring to shift their weight and be bored until it's over. Zed sees what he's looking for when the body language of the crowd switches from anger to fear. The group of men announced during their first interactions that a fear of magic is the master they serve. Zed creates a bigger fear of what he will do to them for being dumb enough to think a wizard would be vulnerable to anything a bunch of farmers and woods guides could do. Once Zed knows their self-induced fear has made him their new master, he manages to throw his voice in 50 different directions when John says he should let them all go home unharmed, which is exactly what Zed wanted in the first place. Zed tells them he's a vengeful wizard who's mad at them for trying to take his most valuable possession from him, his life, and that he will have his vengeance, and he will have his vengeance by taking the thing they value most above all else. The men root around in their pants and collectively discover their manhood has disappeared. They then erupt into what can only be described by the words the author chose, into a 3-ring circuit of stooge-related antics. The thing is, I'm not joking. Listen to the following list of things, and you give me one example, read fast in the comments below, that wouldn't also apply to an episode of the Three Stooges. Oh, the thing is, I'm not even joking. Listen to the following list of things, and you give me one example in the comments below that wouldn't also apply to an episode of the Three Stooges. Putting their hands into their pockets, cautiously feeling around. There were moans and wails. Soon the men were all grabbing at their crotches. Pandemonium broke out. Men are jumping up and down, crying, grabbing at themselves, running around in little circles, falling on the ground, asking for help, sobbing, going, nyuk, nyuk, nyuk. Oh, a wise guy, eh? Oh, that last one I scribbled in myself next to my notes. Forget about that one. But all the other ones are a perfect fit. Zed tells them, hit the road, and then winks at the camera Richard and Kaylin are standing in front of, clearly pleased with himself. The newly converted 50-man Westland Castrato choir for the advancement of whatever will make the angry wizard give me back my balls tells the angry wizard they will do whatever he wants to make him give them back their balls. Zed makes them apologize, admit they were acting stupidly, and that the old man was only trying to be their friend, and that Zed is smarter than they are, much taller, and has the body of a man half his age. Once they apologize, Zed tells them he'll put things back if they go and tell their families they're being dumb, and they almost made a mistake, and that magic doesn't kill people. Pissed off wizards who are sick of getting the business kill people, with magic. The men leave, but Zed stops them. He says, look at this mess. Go clean up after yourself and get out of here. And to round out the end of the Stooge parody, the men even run away in cartoon fashion, walking normally and then gradually picking up speed before turning the entire event into an unscheduled flash mob of people running the 200-meter dash. So the big question Richard has after all of this is, how did Zed make them think their good and plenties had disappeared? Zed repeatedly claims to have done this without magic. In an article by MentalItch.com by the Tangan Yucky Laughing Epidemic, it tells a story which psychologically resembles the transformation seen here. The story goes, in January of 1962 at an all-girls boarding school, 3 girls started laughing uncontrollably and it spread throughout the boarding school. At first it affected 95 of their 159 pupils, and these pupils were aged 12 to 18. The symptoms lasted for a few hours to a total of 16 days in those affected by the epidemic. The school was forced to shut down in March of 1962 as a result. Students were sent home to their parents. The laughing epidemic started to spread to Nashamba, a nearby village. Almost 217 people had laughing attacks in April and May of 1962. The laughter epidemic spread further from Kashashana to the village of Nashamba and throughout the school near Bubuka. This eventually spread to the borders of the entire country. People experienced symptoms such as laughing attacks, crying, flatulence, fainting, pain, rashes, respiratory problems accompanied by occasional violence, restlessness, and aimless running. The laughing epidemic lasted 18 months, and then it eventually died out. At the International Society for Humor Studies Conference, real thing, Christian F. Heppenflipperman, in an interview with the Chicago Tribune, said the incident was caught by an underlying shared stress factor in the population. Laughter was just a symptom of mass hysteria, aka mass psychogenic illness, which also caused the other symptoms such as pain, farting, respiratory problems, and crying fits. Mass psychogenic illness often occurs in people who have little power to control their worlds or express their emotions, so their mind finds whatever way they can to release it. Zed meticulously constructed an orchestrated panic attack, and when it was ready, transformed it into a full-blown episode of mass hysteria, making literal and figurative fools of all of them. Once the moment is over and they leave, all of traces of Zed's levity go with them. He calls them idiots and says that their call to action was not called on their own behalf. In much the same way that Zed puts fear into the crowd, followed by a call to action. He recognizes that these men had fear put into them from an outside force, convincing them there was wisdom in forming a collection of angry people gathered together to respond to their collective cognitive dissonance. The necessity for a crowd in this situation is further evidence in their lack of belief in their own capacity for reason. Those feelings exist, and because the individuals who feel compelled to act in response to those feelings are limited by their ability to do so with conviction, they find the conviction by gathering together, so their faith doesn't need to come from themselves. It comes from the group of individuals who have collectively made that decision. Well, the author doesn't go any further into this. I will add one final piece of information of my own regarding that this is a natural conclusion of the argument Goodkind has been making. The power of assembly is the same thing as everything else in this chapter. It is neither good or evil. It just is. It is a force which can be rooted in logic, reason, and the knowledge every living person has ownership of their consent. An assembly has access to the skills and talents of every person inside it, and it is made up of people who organize these groups, as well as the individuals who make up the group that all need to take responsibility for the power created by organizing. Notice how Zed calls them idiots, but he doesn't blame them for it. He sees them as a group of individuals who willingly give up their free will by deciding how to follow how information feels instead of what that information is making them think. When Zed tells them it was all a trick and actually making their manhood disappear would be much more difficult than convincing them it had, Zed gives Richard and Kaylin a first-hand example of the power behind the wizard's first rule. When a person allows bias to switch their belief, they can no longer determine the actual truth of a situation. The symbolism of emasculation is a commonly used one in literature to convey a loss of power or strength. The author just as easily could have struck them with hysterical blindness or any other sort of psychosomatic affliction. He chose to emasculate to drive home the point of emotionally guided decision-making's ability to separate the power of free will from an individual. They agreed to give up this power, but they were not aware of the method used to convince them to make that choice. Zed laments their choice and calls them idiots for making it, but he does not fully blame them for falling prey to a more cognitively aware influencing, pushing them to evil when he used the very same cognitive tools to prevent evil from happening. To keep Richard from falling into the trap of correlation without causation, Zed reminds Richard that even though it was just a trick, the results are what matter. They are safe and the men got to keep their lives. Zed determines Dark and Rawl is somehow behind this, but he's made a mistake by not sending enough of a threat to finish the job. Richard asks the question he should have asked back at his cabin early on. Why would Dark and Rawl do this? Because if he's smart enough to orchestrate the event, he must be smart enough to know how to make it succeed. While Richard focuses on what they need to do to prepare for their journey, he's distracted by an odd feeling. Call it intuition or prophecy. Given the language used to describe it, it feels like a minor manifestation of his gift, warning him that he is in violation of the wizard's first rule in much the same way his mind warned him when he was in violation of the wizard's third rule. While he receives the warning from within, much the same as the men are warned when Richard pulls the sword, he decides not to ignore it and begins to assess his situation rationally from all points of view. He considers Zed's argument that Rawl was lazy and they're too smart to be caught off guard by such a feeble attempt. After observing the situation from outside Zed's biased perspective, Richard realizes there's more to the story that explains everything they already knew and a lot of the things they don't. Richard makes the same conclusion about the series events that I make about the backpack in his house being undisturbed. Richard says this was all part of Dark and Rawl's plan so they would feel safe and confident about how smart they are when he comes in and kills them all in one swoop. When Richard says Dark and Rawl is most likely on his way to kill them right now, Kaylin's eyes are opened, and she confirms everything Richard is thinking is consistent with Dark and Rawl's behavior. Zed condenses all of the cognitive dissonance generated by this presentation of information into a single swear, and then agrees they need to leave now. Even though Richard tells him they don't have time to think, Zed says he must grab his rock and runs away to grab it without taking a single moment to engage in a battle of cognitive dissonance with Richard about how much time they do or don't have. Richard goes inside, grabs his pack, confirms the tooth under his shirt, and gives Kaylin a cloak. While he would like to take more, he decides he isn't missing anything that would be worth risking their lives for. Because he didn't waste time arguing, Zed is already back and waiting for them once Richard and Kaylin are ready to leave. Richard asks Zed where the rock is, and Zed tells him it's inside his pocket. When they get ready to leave, Zed's cat walks up to see them and figure out what's going on. Zed opens Richard's backpack and tucks the 12-pound furry beast inside. At best, Zed's cat introduces dirt and other debris to mix with the contents of the backpack. At worst, he's introducing a trace amount of feline fecal matter as well. Given that the current best estimates place the number of apples inside Richard's backpack at 198, this should remind everyone that while I won't tell you what to do, it's always a good idea to wash fresh fruits and vegetables ahead of time. It's also an acceptable choice to know the risks of foodborne illness ahead of time and decide that the amount of effort that would go into offsetting the risk is a bigger waste of life than the problems prevented by the practice. While they're leaving, Richard senses something in the darkness that makes him feel uneasy. He feels like they're being watched from the darkness. Kaylin asks him what's wrong, and Richard is guided by his feelings when he decides it must be his own fear, and he couldn't possibly be anything else, and as a result, he lies to her and says, "Nothing is wrong, let's go." Kaylin accepts the flimsy explanation, which is clearly at odds with the observation her senses are telling her that Richard is troubled by something. While they're traveling away from Zed's house, they all reflect on the events of the evening. When the author tells us, the cat pokes its head outside of the backpack to look around, and has done so since it was a kitten, we learn that Richard's casual disregard for potential cross-contamination of apples with E. coli goes back at least a dozen years. They move quickly, and after a while, Zed uses some magic dust to cover their trail. Richard asks, "What about the cloud?" and Zed says, "Don't worry about it." A little while later, a giant flame shoots up into the sky, and Zed says that Dark and Raw was at his house, and he's being a very poor house guest, wrecking up the place. Kaylin says she's sorry, and Zed obeys the conservation of cognitive dissonance when he replies that it's okay and it could have been them alongside all of his possessions. Kaylin asks Richard if they know where he's going, and he says he does and leaves it at that. He smiles to himself because this time he's telling the truth. The chapter ends with a cliffhanger as we're given a third-person omniscient view of two flying beasts, passively identified as Gars by their glowing green eyes, rapidly descending towards the three of them to attack from behind. It's time for the official #1 quote from Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth in Wizard's First Rule, Chapter 10. Please note that the views and opinions of this official #1 quote for this chapter may differ from the views and opinions expressed by you about what your #1 favorite quote about this chapter is. In the event that your #1 quote is different from the one mentioned here, please list your candidate for #1 quote in the comments below. And the official #1 quote is, "The seeker is the weapon. The sword is just a tool." In the next chapter, all three of them are attacked by a monster, and Richard is almost killed during a failed attempt at home invasion. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you feel like you've gotten something of value from this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you really like it, I ask you share a link to the video with those you think might enjoy it as well. If those feelings aren't there yet, I invite you to come back for the next episode and give me a chance to try and change your mind. Thank you for watching. My name is Tom, and I have been your guide. This has been Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. Come and join me next time so that while I am seeking these truths, you can become seekers of that truth as well. Thank you, and I hope to see you again. Until then, live well.